The collapse. It was an unseasonably crisp evening in Manhattan, the kind of night where the city buzzed with life as lights twinkled against the darkened skyline. On the corner of 56th and Madison, the LeBlanc Bistro radiated elegance. Inside, affluent diners indulged in their curated meals, their conversations laced with laughter and clinking glasses. Among them sat Virginia Whitmore, a 65-year-old socialite whose name carried weight in the city's elite circles. Draped in pearls and clad in a tailored cream suit that likely cost more than most people's monthly salaries, Virginia's air of superiority was unmistakable. Virginia held court at the table, her voice sharp as she recounted a story to her friends about a botched gala she had recently attended. Her wit was razor-sharp, and her disdain for those she deemed inferior was well known. She gestured with a manicured hand, holding her wine glass as if it were a scepter. "Honestly, darling," she said with a smirk, "some people simply don't belong in our world. You can always tell, can't you?" Her companions chuckled politely, though one or two glanced away uncomfortably. Virginia was known for her biting commentary, but tonight, there was an edge to her tone that even her closest friends found unsettling. As the waiter brought another bottle of her favorite Bordeaux, Virginia reached for a bite of her duck confit. But before the fork could reach her lips, a sharp, searing pain shot through her chest. Her hand froze midair, the fork clattering onto her plate. Her vision blurred as her breath became shallow and rapid. Panic set in, and she clutched the edge of the table for support. "Virginia," one of her friends said, alarmed. "Are you all right?" But Virginia couldn't respond. The pain intensified, radiating down her left arm. She gasped for air, her body trembling as she slid off her chair onto the floor. The lively bistro was suddenly silenced, all eyes turning toward the commotion. "Call 911, someone shouted, their voice cutting through the panic. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. The once poised Virginia was now pale and barely conscious as they strapped her onto a stretcher. Her pearls glinted under the harsh restaurant lights, a stark reminder of the life she had crafted so carefully. As she was wheeled out, her vision darkened, and the last thing she heard was a calm, steady voice saying, "Her vitals are weak. We need to get her to West Manhattan General immediately." Dr. Jamal Harris was finishing his shift at West Manhattan General when the emergency alert came through. At 38, Jamal was one of the hospital's most respected surgeons, known for his precision and unflappable demeanor. His tall frame and confident stride conveyed authority, but it was his compassionate bedside manner that endeared him to both patients and staff. Jamal was about to head home after a grueling 14-hour shift when the call came in. He glanced at the chart handed to him by a nurse. 65-year-old female, cardiac arrest en route from LeBlanc Bistro. Stabilized in transit but critical. ETA, 2 minutes. Jamal's exhaustion vanished. "Let's prep the ore," he said, pulling on his gloves. "We'll need to move fast." When Virginia was wheeled into the emergency room, Jamal quickly assessed her condition. The monitors beeped erratically, and her face was ashen. He issued orders with practiced calm, his team responding instantly. "Administer 300 milligrams of amiodarone. Prepare for an angiogram," he instructed. "We're going to need to locate the blockage and move her into surgery immediately." For hours, Jamal worked with meticulous focus. The surgery required every ounce of his skill and experience. His team moved in synchronized precision, following his lead. The blockage in Virginia's left anterior descending artery, known grimly among doctors as the "widowmaker," was severe, but Jamal's steady hands guided the catheter and stent into place, restoring blood flow to her heart. As dawn broke over the city, Jamal removed his gloves and let out a deep breath. "She's stable," he told his team. "Great work, everyone." Virginia awoke 2 days later in a private hospital room. The sterile white walls and rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor were a jarring contrast to the luxurious surroundings she was accustomed to. Disoriented, she frowned as a nurse entered the room, her face brightening when she saw Virginia awake. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore, the nurse said with a smile. You gave us quite a scare, but you're on the road to recovery. Let me call Dr. Harris. He's the one who saved your life. Virginia's brow furrowed. Dr. Harris, she repeated, her voice hoarse. Moments later, Jamal entered the room. His white coat was pristine, and his clipboard rested in his hand. He approached Virginia with a professional yet warm demeanor. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. I'm Dr. Jamal Harris. How are you feeling? Virginia's eyes widened as she took in the tall black man standing before her. Her lips tightened, and her face hardened. You're my doctor, she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. Jamal nodded, unfazed. That's correct. I performed the emergency surgery that saved your life. Virginia's lips thinned into a sharp line. Wasn't there anyone else available? The nurse froze, her smile fading as the tension in the room thickened. Jamal's expression remained composed, though a flicker of disappointment crossed his eyes. I assure you, Mrs. Whitmore, you were in capable hands, he replied evenly. Virginia turned her head away, muttering under her breath. I suppose I didn't have much of a choice. Jamal remained silent for a moment before excusing himself. Outside the room, the nurse caught up to him, her face etched with concern. Dr. Harris, I'm so sorry about that, she said softly. Jamal gave her a small, reassuring smile. It's not the first time, Maggie, and it probably won't be the last. Let's focus on her recovery. Back in his office, Jamal leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Encounters like this weren't new to him, but they never got easier. He had worked tirelessly to become one of the best in his field, yet moments like these reminded him of the prejudices that still lingered. Dr. Elena Carter, one of his closest colleagues and mentors, stopped by. Noticing his pensive expression, she pulled up a chair. What happened? She asked. Jamal sighed. The patient from the LeBlanc Bistro. She's furious that I'm her doctor. Could barely look at me. Elena's face softened. It's exhausting, isn't it? Being both a healer and a mirror to people's biases. Jamal nodded. I try not to let it get to me, but it's hard. You save someone's life, and all they can see is the color of your skin. Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. You're more than a doctor, Jamal. You're a testament to perseverance and excellence. Don't let her ignorance undermine your brilliance. Jamal managed a small smile. Thanks, Elena. It helps to hear that. As he prepared for his rounds, Jamal resolved to treat Virginia with the same care and professionalism he gave all his patients. He couldn't change her prejudices. Confronting the shadows. The next morning, Dr. Jamal Harris entered Virginia Whitmore's hospital room with his usual professional demeanor. He had reviewed her charts overnight and adjusted her treatment plan to ensure a smooth recovery. Her vitals had improved significantly, but her attitude remained a lingering concern. Virginia sat upright in bed, her lips pursed in a thin line of displeasure. Her pearl necklace, somehow out of place against the sterile hospital gown, glinted under the fluorescent light. The tray in front of her held untouched food, the toast cold and the tea still steaming. Her eyes narrowed as Jamal approached. Mrs. Whitmore, Jamal greeted her, his tone calm and measured. How are you feeling this morning? Virginia's gaze flickered over him briefly before she looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. I suppose I feel as well as can be expected, she said, her tone clipped. Considering the circumstances. Jamal ignored the pointed edge in her voice and stepped closer, adjusting the monitor that displayed her heart rate. Your vitals are stable, and your recovery is progressing well. I'll be overseeing your care for the next few days to ensure there are no complications. Virginia's lips pressed together so tightly they almost disappeared. Overseeing my care, she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. How fortunate for me. Jamal glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Is there something you'd like to address, Mrs. Whitmore? He asked, his voice even. She looked at him sharply, her gray eyes cold. Yes. I'd like to know why someone else couldn't have been assigned to my case. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Jamal's grip on the clipboard tightened ever so slightly, but he maintained his composure. I was the attending surgeon on call, he replied calmly. My team and I worked to save your life. If you have concerns about your care, I'd be happy to address them. Virginia huffed and looked away. No, I suppose that won't be necessary, she muttered, her tone dismissive. Jamal nodded, choosing not to engage further. He adjusted her foredrip and made a few notes on his clipboard. The nurses will check on you throughout the day, he said. Let them know if you experience any discomfort. Without waiting for a response, he turned and left the room, his shoulders squared and his steps measured. Back in his office, Jamal sat at his desk, staring at the stack of charts in front of him. He had dealt with difficult patients before, but something about Virginia's disdain cut deeper than usual. Perhaps it was her audacity to question his competence after he had saved her life. Or perhaps it was the way her prejudice felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of the barriers he had overcome to stand where he was. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Dr. Elena Carter stepped inside, her eyes scanning his face. She's still giving you a hard time, isn't she? Elena asked, leaning against the doorframe. Jamal sighed and rubbed his temples. She's challenging, he admitted. I've seen this kind of attitude before, but it never gets easier. Elena crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. You know, Jamal, people like her are often more afraid than they are hateful. Prejudice is just a mask for fear, fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear of losing control. Jamal raised an eyebrow. That may be true, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating. Elena smiled faintly. No, it doesn't. But you've always been good at rising above it. Don't let her ignorance take away from what you've accomplished. You're a damn good doctor, Jamal. And deep down, I think even she knows that. Jamal chuckled softly. You always know what to say, Elena. She shrugged. That's what friends are for. Later that day, Jamal made his rounds, checking on other patients and ensuring the hospital's operations were running smoothly. He found solace in the routine, the steady rhythm of patient care. But as he approached Virginia's room again, a sense of dread crept in. This time, when he entered, Virginia was sitting up in bed, flipping through a magazine. She looked up when he walked in, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Whitmore, Jamal greeted her. How are you feeling this afternoon? She closed the magazine and set it aside. I suppose I've felt worse, she said, her tone less sharp than before. Though I can't say I'm thrilled to be here. Jamal nodded. That's understandable. No one enjoys being in the hospital. But I'm glad to see you're improving. Virginia studied him for a moment, her gray eyes searching his face. You seem very confident in what you do, she said, her tone cautious. Jamal met her gaze. I've worked hard to be good at my job, he replied simply. She looked away, fiddling with the edge of her blanket. I suppose that's commendable. Jamal tilted his head slightly, sensing a shift in her demeanor. Is there something on your mind, Mrs. Whitmore? She hesitated, her fingers stilling. It's nothing. Never mind. Jamal didn't press her. If you ever want to talk, I'm here, he said. For now, focus on resting. Your heart needs time to heal. As he left the room, he couldn't help but wonder what had caused the slight change in her attitude. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in his line of work, even the smallest progress mattered. That evening, Virginia stared out the window of her hospital room, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She thought about the man who had saved her life, the man she had dismissed so quickly because of the color of his skin. Deep down, a part of her knew she had been unfair. But admitting that, even to herself, was a battle she wasn't ready to face. For the first time in years, Virginia felt a crack in the armor of her carefully constructed world. And though she didn't know it yet, that crack was the beginning of something far greater than she could have imagined. Cracks in the armor. The following day began with a rush of activity at West Manhattan General Hospital. Nurses moved swiftly between rooms, doctors reviewed charts in hurried conversations, and the faint hum of medical monitors created a constant backdrop of urgency. In the middle of this organized chaos, Dr. Jamal Harris maintained his usual composed demeanor, his focus as sharp as ever. Jamal started his rounds early, weaving through hallways filled with the steady rhythm of healthcare in motion. He knew that Virginia Whitmore was on his schedule for the morning. Though her attitude had been grating, he saw her as no different from any other patient in need of care. He had vowed to himself long ago that prejudice, no matter how overt or insidious, would never deter him from doing his job. When he reached her room, the air felt different. Virginia sat upright in bed, flipping idly through a newspaper. Her posture was rigid, and her face held the same steely expression, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Jamal said, stepping into the room. "How are you feeling today?" She glanced up briefly, her lips pursed. "As well as can be expected, I suppose." Jamal checked her chart, noting her improved vitals. "Your progress has been encouraging. Your heart rate is steady, and your lab results show significant improvement. If things continue on this trajectory, we might be able to discuss discharge plans soon." Virginia's eyes narrowed slightly, as though the prospect of leaving the hospital unsettled her. She murmured noncommittally, returning her gaze to the newspaper. Jamal set the clipboard down and regarded her thoughtfully. "Mrs. Whitmore, is there something on your mind? You seem preoccupied." She stiffened, her hands tightening around the edges of the newspaper. For a moment, it seemed she might ignore him altogether, but then she spoke. "Dr. Harris," she began, her voice measured and clipped, "I've always been someone who values standards. High standards. In every aspect of my life." Jamal nodded, unsure where she was going but willing to listen. "And," she continued, her gaze fixed on a distant point, "it's challenging for me to adjust when those standards are not met. Or when things don't align with what I've expected." Jamal's expression remained neutral, though he felt the weight of her words. He chose his response carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand that change can be difficult," he said. "But I can assure you that my team and I are committed to providing the highest level of care for every patient, regardless of expectations or circumstances." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away. "I'm sure you believe that," she muttered under her breath. Later that day, as Jamal reviewed notes in his office, a nurse named Maggie knocked on the door. She stepped in, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Dr. Harris, I thought you should know. Mrs. Whitmore had a visitor this afternoon," Maggie said. Jamal looked up, intrigued. "A visitor? Who was it?" Maggie hesitated. "Her daughter. At least, I think it was her daughter." The interaction was tense. Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Tense how?" Maggie sighed. "I didn't catch much of the conversation, but it seemed like they were arguing. The daughter left pretty quickly, and Mrs. Whitmore hasn't said a word about it since." Jamal leaned back in his chair, considering this new development. He hadn't known much about Virginia's personal life, but this interaction hinted at deeper fractures beneath her polished exterior. "Thanks for letting me know, Maggie," he said. "I'll keep it in mind." That evening, Jamal returned to Virginia's room for a routine checkup. He found her staring out the window, her expression pensive. The glow of the city lights reflected in her eyes, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jamal said gently, breaking the silence. "I'm here to check on your recovery. How are you feeling?" She didn't turn to face him but spoke quietly. "Do you have children, Dr. Harris?" The question caught him off guard. "No, I don't," he replied. "But I have nieces and nephews." "Why do you ask?" Virginia's gaze remained fixed on the skyline. "I have a daughter," she said, her voice tinged with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "We haven't spoken properly in years. Too many disagreements. Too many differences." Jamal set his clipboard down, sensing that this was a rare moment of openness. "Sometimes relationships are complicated," he said carefully. "But it's never too late to try to mend them." She let out a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so simple. But it's not. Especially when you've built your life on certain principles that others don't understand or respect." Jamal chose his words with care. "Mrs. Whitmore, sometimes the principles we hold on to the tightest are the ones that keep us from moving forward. They can become walls instead of foundations." She finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "And what do you know about walls, Dr. Harris?" Jamal met her gaze, his voice steady. "More than you might think. But I also know that walls can come down, brick by brick, if you're willing to do the work." Virginia said nothing, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. Finally, she nodded slightly, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible. As Jamal left her room that night, he felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it seemed that Virginia's defenses were beginning to crack. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And in his experience, even the smallest openings could lead to profound change. Bridging the divide. The next morning brought a rare stillness to West Manhattan General Hospital. The hustle and bustle of the early hours were subdued, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Dr. Jamal Harris sat at his desk, scrolling through patient files, but his mind lingered on Virginia Whitmore. Her subtle nod from the night before had stirred something within him, a flicker of hope that perhaps, beneath the layers of prejudice and pride, there was room for growth. As Jamal prepared for his rounds, Maggie, the nurse, entered with a tray of coffee and a knowing smile. "You've been brooding all morning," she said, setting a cup on his desk. "Thinking about Mrs. Whitmore, aren't you?" Jamal chuckled softly. "You know me too well, Maggie." She leaned against the desk, her expression thoughtful. "I saw her daughter in the waiting area earlier. She looked upset. I think she's trying to decide whether to come back in." Jamal's brows furrowed. "Did she say anything to you?" Maggie shook her head. "No, but I get the sense there's a lot unsaid between them. Maybe you could encourage Mrs. Whitmore to talk to her." Jamal nodded, considering the idea. It might be worth a try. Sometimes it takes a third party to help bridge the gap. When Jamal entered Virginia's room later that morning, he found her sitting by the window, gazing out at the city skyline. The newspaper lay untouched on the bedside table, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Jamal greeted her, his voice warm. "How are you feeling today?" She glanced at him briefly before returning her gaze to the window. "I've been better," she admitted, her tone lacking its usual edge. Jamal pulled up a chair and sat across from her, setting his clipboard aside. "I heard your daughter visited yesterday," he said gently. "Have you spoken to her since then?" Virginia's jaw tightened, and she looked down at her hands. "No. She left before I had the chance. Or maybe I didn't give her one." Jamal leaned forward slightly, his tone encouraging. "Relationships can be complicated, especially when emotions run high. But it's clear she cares about you. She wouldn't have come otherwise." Virginia let out a bitter laugh. "Caring about someone doesn't mean you understand them. She thinks I'm stuck in my ways, that I can't see the world as it really is." Jamal regarded her thoughtfully. "And do you think she's right?" Virginia's eyes snapped up to meet his, a flicker of defiance in her gaze. But as the seconds passed, her shoulders slumped, and her expression softened. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Maybe I've held on to certain beliefs for so long that they've become a part of me. Letting go of them feels impossible." Jamal nodded, his voice steady. "Change is never easy, Mrs. Whitmore. But it starts with a willingness to listen, to yourself, to others, and to the truths that make us uncomfortable." She looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded. "Perhaps you're right." Later that afternoon, Jamal approached Virginia's daughter, Emily, who sat in the hospital's waiting area. She was a striking woman in her mid-30s, her features softened by a mixture of worry and determination. She looked up as Jamal approached, her eyes filled with apprehension. "Ms. Whitmore," Jamal began, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Harris. I've been overseeing your mother's care." Emily shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for taking care of her, Dr. Harris. I can't imagine it's been easy." Jamal smiled faintly. "Your mother is strong-willed. But she's also making progress, both physically and emotionally. She mentioned your visit yesterday. I think she regrets not speaking with you more." Emily's expression softened, and she sighed. "I want to talk to her, but every time I try, it feels like we're speaking different languages. She's so set in her ways, and I don't know how to reach her." Jamal nodded empathetically. "Sometimes it takes patience. And sometimes it takes a moment of vulnerability to open the door. Would you be willing to try again?" Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. After a moment, she nodded. "I'll try." When Emily entered Virginia's room later that day, the tension was palpable. Virginia looked up, her expression guarded, but there was a flicker of surprise and perhaps relief in her eyes. "Emily," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I didn't expect to see you again." Emily took a seat by the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "I wanted to talk. I feel like we don't do that enough." Virginia looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "Perhaps that's true." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching thin between them. Then Emily took a deep breath and broke the stillness. "Mom, I've always admired your strength," she began. "But sometimes, that strength feels like a wall. It's hard to get through to you, to feel like you really hear me." Virginia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't interrupt. "I know we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things," Emily continued. "But that doesn't mean I don't love you. And it doesn't mean I don't want to understand you better. But I need you to meet me halfway." Virginia's gaze remained fixed on her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be certain about everything," she said. "But lately, I've realized that certainty can be a cage. Maybe it's time I learned how to open the door." Emily reached out and took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "That's all I've ever wanted, Mom." Outside the room, Jamal watched through the small window in the door, a faint smile on his lips. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of connection between the two women. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. And sometimes, a single step was all it took to begin the journey. The turning point. The tension in Virginia Whitmore's hospital room began to soften in the days following her heartfelt conversation with her daughter, Emily. The cracks in Virginia's hardened exterior became more apparent, and while she remained guarded, she seemed less resistant to the world outside her own carefully constructed reality. For Dr. Jamal Harris, these subtle changes did not go unnoticed. One crisp morning, Jamal made his way into Virginia's room to check on her progress. She was sitting up in bed, her gray hair neatly combed, and her eyes focused on the view outside the window. The faint sounds of the bustling city filtered into the room, a reminder of the life teeming just beyond the hospital walls. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Jamal greeted, his tone warm but professional. "You're looking better today." Virginia turned to face him, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Good morning, Dr. Harris. I suppose I am feeling better. Though I can't say this is my ideal vacation destination." Jamal chuckled softly, setting down his clipboard. "Most people don't consider hospitals their first choice for a getaway. But I'm glad to see your sense of humor is intact." Virginia's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "Dr. Harris," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about our conversations. About expectations and walls, as you called them." Jamal raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "And what have you been thinking?" She sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "I've spent so much of my life believing certain things. Things about people, about the world. But lately, I've started to wonder if some of those beliefs have done more harm than good." Jamal nodded, his voice gentle. "Change often starts with self-reflection. Recognizing the weight of those beliefs is the first step toward understanding and growth." Virginia met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I'm not saying I've completely changed overnight, Dr. Harris. But I'm willing to try. To see things differently." Jamal's smile was genuine. "That's all anyone can ask, Mrs. Whitmore. Change doesn't happen all at once. It's a process, and it sounds like you're taking the first steps." Later that afternoon, Emily returned to the hospital, her demeanor lighter than before. She carried a small bouquet of flowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the sterile white walls of the hospital. When she entered Virginia's room, her mother looked up with a mixture of surprise and warmth. "Emily," Virginia said, her voice softer than usual. "You didn't have to bring me flowers." Emily smiled, setting the bouquet on the bedside table. "I wanted to. They brightened up the room when I saw them in the shop, and I thought they might do the same for you." Virginia's gaze lingered on the flowers, her expression contemplative. "They're beautiful. Thank you." Emily took a seat beside the bed, her eyes searching her mother's face. "You seem different today. Lighter, maybe." Virginia let out a small laugh, though it lacked her usual sharpness. "Dr. Harris has a way of making me think differently about things. About myself. It's unsettling, but not entirely unpleasant." Emily raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "He does have that effect. He's a remarkable person." Virginia's lips tightened briefly, but then she nodded. "Yes, he is. And I owe him more than I care to admit. More than just my life, perhaps." Emily's smile widened, and she reached for her mother's hand. "That's a good start, Mom. Maybe it's time to let some of those walls down." Virginia didn't reply immediately, but her fingers tightened around Emily's in a silent acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Jamal found himself reflecting on the progress he had witnessed in Virginia. He had seen many patients confront their biases in his years as a doctor, but each instance was unique. For some, the realization of their prejudice was too much to bear. For others, it became the catalyst for profound change. Elena Carter, his trusted mentor and friend, stopped by his office as the day wound down. She leaned against the doorframe, her expression curious. "How's Mrs. Whitmore doing?" she asked. Jamal leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. "Better. She's starting to open up, I think. There's still a long way to go, but she's taking steps in the right direction." Elena nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "It's always rewarding to see that kind of progress. But don't forget to take care of yourself, Jamal. These cases can take a toll." Jamal chuckled softly. "I'll be fine, Elena. Watching someone grow, even just a little, makes it all worth it." That evening, as the hospital quieted down, Virginia sat in her room, the bouquet of flowers casting faint shadows on the wall. She thought about the people who had surrounded her in the past few days, Emily, with her unwavering love and patience, Dr. Harris, with his quiet strength and wisdom. For the first time in years, Virginia felt something shift within her. It was subtle, like the first crack of ice thawing in the spring. But it was there, and it was real. And as she drifted off to sleep, the rhythmic beat of the heart monitor a steady companion, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a different way to live. A way that didn't rely on walls and divisions but on connection and understanding. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Virginia felt ready to take the first step. A new perspective. The following day, the sunlight filtered softly through the blinds of Virginia Whitmore's hospital room. The bouquet of flowers Emily had brought now rested in a glass vase on the bedside table, adding a pop of color to the otherwise sterile environment. Virginia sat up in bed, her posture straighter than it had been in days, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time, she seemed to take in the room with fresh eyes, no longer focused solely on her own discomfort. Dr. Jamal Harris entered with his usual calm demeanor, holding a clipboard and wearing a faint smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted her. "You're looking much better today. How are you feeling?" Virginia met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no trace of her earlier hostility. Instead, her expression was thoughtful, almost contemplative. "I'm feeling, well, Dr. Harris," she replied. "Better than I have in a long time, I think." Jamal raised an eyebrow, pleased but curious. "That's good to hear. Your vitals are excellent, and I'd say you're on track for a full recovery. We might even be able to discharge you by the end of the week." Virginia nodded slowly, her fingers brushing over the blanket. "Dr. Harris, may I speak candidly with you?" Jamal set the clipboard aside and folded his hands. "Of course. I'm here to listen." She took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "I want to apologize. For how I treated you when we first met. For my assumptions." Jamal's expression softened, but he said nothing, allowing her the space to continue. "I've lived my life a certain way," Virginia admitted. "Believing certain things about people, about the world. It's easy to hold on to those beliefs when you're surrounded by others who think the same way. But being here, being in this hospital, and seeing how you and your team cared for me, it's made me question things I thought I'd never question." Jamal nodded gently. "Growth often comes from the most unexpected places. I'm glad you're allowing yourself to reflect." Virginia's lips curved into a small smile, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It's humbling. And terrifying. But I think it's necessary." Jamal reached for the vase of flowers on her bedside table, adjusting it slightly so the sunlight caught the petals. "Sometimes, the hardest part of change is taking the first step. But from what I've seen, you're stronger than you realize." Later that afternoon, Emily returned to the hospital with a bag of her mother's favorite pastries. When she entered the room, Virginia greeted her with a genuine smile, a warmth that caught Emily by surprise. "Mom, you look different today," Emily remarked, setting the bag on the table. "Lighter, somehow." Virginia chuckled softly. "I suppose I've been doing some thinking. Dr. Harris has a way of inspiring reflection." Emily's eyes widened slightly. "You mean you've been talking to him? Actually talking?" Virginia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes. And listening, too. He's remarkable. More than I gave him credit for when we first met. I was wrong about him, Emily. And I've been wrong about a lot of things." Emily's face softened, and she reached out to take her mother's hand. "That's a brave thing to admit, Mom. I'm proud of you." Virginia squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Thank you. I don't deserve your patience, but I'm grateful for it." On the day of Virginia's discharge, the hospital staff gathered to bid her farewell. She had become something of a fixture during her stay, and her transformation had not gone unnoticed. As Jamal entered her room for the final time, she was seated in a wheelchair, her belongings packed neatly by her side. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I've been thinking about how to thank you, but words don't seem enough." Jamal smiled warmly. "Your recovery is thanks enough, Mrs. Whitmore. It's why I do what I do." She hesitated, then extended her hand. "Thank you. For everything. Not just for saving my life, but for helping me see things differently." Jamal shook her hand firmly, his eyes reflecting his respect for her journey. "It's been an honor, Mrs. Whitmore. Take care of yourself." As she was wheeled out of the room, Virginia glanced back one last time, her gaze lingering on the doctor who had changed her life in more ways than one. Months later, Jamal received a handwritten letter at his office. The elegant script on the envelope was unmistakable. He opened it to find a heartfelt note from Virginia. "Dear Dr. Harris, I wanted to thank you again for all you did for me during my time at West Manhattan General. Since leaving the hospital, I've made a conscious effort to change, to be more open, more understanding, and less quick to judge. It hasn't been easy, but I'm learning. Emily and I have grown closer, and for the first time in years, I feel like we truly understand each other. I owe much of that to you. Your patience and compassion showed me the kind of person I want to be. Please know that you've made a difference, not just in my life but in the lives of those around me. For that, I will always be grateful. Sincerely, Virginia Whitmore." Jamal folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, a smile playing on his lips. For him, it wasn't just about saving lives, it was about changing them. And Virginia Whitmore's transformation was proof that even the most entrenched walls could come down, brick by brick, when met with patience, empathy, and understanding.